Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeanne Roberts, and I'm from the Appleton Fox Cities League of Women Voters. Welcome to tonight's program on understanding the land acknowledgement guidance document that was created by an ad hoc subcommittee of the Community Alliances Committee. We start with this slide, this next slide, to show the current tribes as well as some of the peoples of the past who have occupied this land that we call Wisconsin. And I would like to introduce right now the other members of the ad hoc committee who created the document that we'll be discussing. Renee Gralewicz from the League of Women Voters of Appleton Fox Cities. Deb Sabol-Williams from the League of Women Voters of Sheboygan. Dee Sweet from the League of Women Voters of Ashland-Bayfield area, and myself, Jeanne Roberts. Today, we are going to go through the guidance document. We'll do a little introduction about why did we create the document. We'll talk a little bit about history of land acknowledgements, a reason to do or not to do land acknowledgements, what to consider when composing land acknowledgements, including tying a land acknowledgement to action, when to do a land acknowledgement, who should do them, working with Indigenous communities, and hopefully we have plenty of time for people to ask questions. If you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to all of your questions. I've also been told that closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen for anybody who would want it. All right, so let's get started. And I'm going to turn it over to Renee.
Well, hello there, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I do want to say that we spent a lot of thoughtful time and great conversations over creating this document. I'm Renee Gralewicz. I'm with the League of Women Voters, Appleton Fox Cities. I'm a descendant, first generation descendant of the Mohicans of Stockbridge, Muncie Mohicans, and an enrolled Brothertown Nation member. So when we were doing this whole idea of doing a land acknowledgement, it really, for me, hit home because every time we started the conversation, somebody would always say, well, what's the point? And that would make me smile and that would tell my mind that's the whole point. It is to inform people with what's going on. So land acknowledgement has been making their way through non-Indigenous entities for many years now. I went to my niece's graduation at UC Sandy, not Sandy, wherever in California. And I was just in awe of the land acknowledgement that was done there. It caught my attention because I did not realize that this movement had such wide sweeping attention. So land acknowledgement, you can see the land you're sitting on was ancestral Indigenous land. And it really is meant to bring home to you what colonialism has done. Colonialism has taken the land by force and some of it by treaty, but colonialism isn't in the past. Colonialism is an ideology. It's an idea that keeps sitting and permeates through all aspects of the US American culture. And colonialism includes the idea of broken treaties, that somehow European nations were much more intelligent, industrious, and deserving of all of the land that they could occupy. And even when there were treaties that were out there, many of the settlers, colonial settlers, either willfully or ignorantly continued to encroach upon Indigenous land. So to do a land acknowledgement says that you are acknowledging colonialism, its history, and its current status within the United States, and acknowledging Indigenous ancestry. So it's important to know you are on Indigenous land. Thanks. Next slide.
Thanks. And now Dee Sweet is going to give us some history of land acknowledgements.
Anin buju niji. Anamikiwasagi Shigokwe Indigenous cause. Makwan Dodane. I come with you, with my colleagues to our audience with a warm heart and a generous handshake. That's something that I've learned from my relatives, the Dakota, who always want to reassure the community that they come in peace and in goodwill. And that's really kind of the backbone of land acknowledgements. As you know, the land acknowledgement is not a new concept. There are traditions associated with the land acknowledgement, very elaborate. Land acknowledgements were intertribal, continue to be intertribal, and most definitely ceremonial. There is an example in the Haudenosaunee, which is the Iroquois Federation of tribes on the eastern seaboard. And the Haudenosaunee represent tribes such as the Onondaga, the Tuscarora, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Seneca. And I'm sure I'm forgetting one, so I apologize for that. But those nations came together as a sort of united front. And whenever people would come into their territory, they wanted to make sure that they received them properly as guests into the homelands. And they also wanted to make sure, they wanted to reassure the villages, as well as the leadership, the traditional chiefs, that the visitors were coming with good intention. They were coming in peace. They acknowledged that this land, they were visitors into this land, and they were going to conduct themselves in a respectful and peaceful manner. So the land acknowledgements have been going on for a long time, out of necessity, really. When we would come into the eastern seaboard around the Sioux or Mackinac Island, we would always greet our Oneida relatives in this fashion. Sometimes there would be a handshake, an embrace, and that in part was not only protocol, but to show an abiding love and respect for one another. Let's come up to the present now, and currently there is a movement, as you may know, in Canada, having to do with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was formed, I believe, in 2007. Right up until 2015, they were acknowledging that a severe historical account of the First Nations people in Canada had to be recognized, had to be reconciled with the history of Canada. And so this commission brought together over 7,000 voices of students that attended the Canada's residential schools. They also petitioned 500-600 tribal leaders, both traditional and elected, and received these testimonies and recommendations having to do with truth and reconciliation. What would be the process? What do we have to consider? How are we going to acknowledge our shared history? And who is going to underwrite this effort? And of course, that went to the provincial governments. So the whole idea of reconciling, or at least recognizing that wherever you stand in North America, wherever you stand, you're standing on Indian land. And I think that land acknowledgements have come into a time of trying to negotiate race relations in our country. And what better place to start is with Indigenous people. The historical, cultural, and the spiritual context of land acknowledgements. We will go through that during tonight's presentations, but I just wanted to highlight that notion that it isn't about land occupancy. You know, when we talk about ancestral lands versus homelands, ancestral lands oftentimes refer to the land that people have occupied since time immemorial. Homelands are slightly different, and maybe I'm lending this definition to the two terms, but homelands are lands that are put aside, that are designated for who? The Great Ojibwe Nation, the Mohicans, who were also from the Eastern Seaboard, the Oneidas, who also came from Canada and New York. So that land was set aside, and when they moved to the Midwest Territory, this is where the Oneidas would live, this is where the Anishinaabe would live, this is where the Mohicans would live, and so on and so forth. So there's a subtle difference to the notion of, when I say I live on the ancestral lands of the Dakota, that's slightly different, actually is worlds of difference from my people, the Anishinaabe. So we are now, and what I delight in hearing people say in Minnesota, Michigan, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and provinces of Canada, when they come to our territory, they recognize, they know enough to recognize that the Dakota people, these are their ancestral lands. They are currently the homelands of the Anishinaabe, and we are charged with taking care of the land, taking the responsibility for stewardship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dee. Renee,
Yeah, Jeanne, if you'll put that other slide up for a moment, please.
the last one?
Yes, please.
Yes.
So I want to point out to you that this map shows you about circa 1850 on where peoples were, and that the effect of colonialism had already taken hold, because you'll look at this map and you see a lot of this Ojibwa, Anishinaabe people into Wisconsin and Minnesota. And their ancestral land and much of their homeland was indeed in the East. And so you see a difference already on how tribes were displaced from their homelands and their ancestral lands already before Wisconsin became a state. Okay, next one, please.
Okay.
So we're not asking you to do a land acknowledgement every time you gather, because as Dee was pointing out, this is ceremonial. It can be ceremonial, and ceremonies don't, I mean, for many of us, it also means sacred, but when you engage in interactions with Indigenous people, it's always ceremony for us. We always have greetings, ways of greeting, and ways of putting people first, and ways of acknowledging your existence and acknowledging your life. And so with that in mind, not every time you gather do you need to do a land acknowledgement. And a lot of it is because it's not something you can check off and put on your agenda and say land acknowledgement, check, check, check. Is that they have to be a purpose for doing this. And Deb will be talking to you about some of the purpose, some of the components that go into when you do a land acknowledgement. So we would hope you would do a land acknowledgement when you have some of your bigger meetings. So your annual meetings, hopefully at the state, there will be a land acknowledgement at the state meetings. I do them all the time for our programs, and we have programs about 4 times a year. And I do those land acknowledgements during those programs because it's not always league people. It's not only league people who are attending our program. And we want to make sure to inform others who are not part of the league and educate them on respect and the idea of doing a land acknowledgement. So land acknowledgement should be tied to the purpose of your meeting, and it always needs to be engaged in with thoughtfulness and with specific determination about doing something with the land acknowledgement. So a lot of organizations have land acknowledgements on their website, their home pages, and that's nice. But once it becomes stagnant, it's no longer ceremonial and perhaps no longer being put forth in a good way. Thanks.
Thank you, Renee. And now Deb will talk about composing the land acknowledgements.
Hello, everyone. I'm Deb Sabol-Williams. I'm a member of the Sheboygan County League of Women Voters, and it has truly been an honor to serve on this committee, and it has been a very, very important educational experience for me. What I'm taking my point of part of this program was from is to share advice from the committee members on the composing of land acknowledgements, and I'll be making 7 points as I go through this. And I also want to make sure that I say to Dee and to Renee that when I'm finished, I think it will be helpful for you to come back in and to point out components or parts that I may have missed. So thank you. So anyway, I'll be making 7 points. And the first bit of advice that I have from the committee is to understand that this is a process. That is one of research and writing, editing, discussing, negotiating, and agreeing as you work on it. And number 2, it will be a struggle. You may find people who react very defensively to the process and to the product that you complete. I'm a Slovak Swedish American who's lived most of my life here in Wisconsin, and many European Americans like me take deep pride in our roots. But until I worked with the terms ancestral land or adopted homeland and land of origin, I had never considered those terms or applied them to myself or my family or my neighbors. And now I understand that we all have ancestral lands. And in my case, my lands are in Slovakia and in Sweden. And I also understand now that ancestral homeland is universally experienced as both a deeply spiritual place and as a physical one. And now looking through this lens, I see that my family's adopted homeland is the ancestral lands of the Native people who've lived here thousands of years. Number 3, composing a land acknowledgement is supposed to be hard. It is difficult. It's a difficult story of broken treaties, land theft, starvation, massacre, genocide, colonialism. I live here in Sheboygan, and at one time it was called by the Ojibwa Sheboygan, meaning great pipe. But like most cities and towns we live in, we barely recognize the indigenous people who are displaced by our settlements. A land acknowledgement requires truth about the suffering incurred by Native people. A land acknowledgement is also an opportunity to honor indigenous tribes and build bridges, consulting with the tribes to tell their story while partnering with local museums and historical societies to seek out and honor tribal legacies. The historic locations and descriptions of Native villages and camps, sacred burial sites, fishing and hunting grounds, the names of chiefs, of lakes and rivers, while telling the story of the Native peoples who thrived and continue to thrive here. Number 4, as you work with your committee and others on the land acknowledgement, we are reminded to welcome respect, honesty, thoughtful attentiveness, sincerity, deliberation, and the opportunity to voice both objections and support. Number 5, strive for connection with the Native people in your area. Reach out to tribal leaders and others for consultation. But as I was reminded, they are busy governing, so keep trying to connect. Attend and support tribal events such as powwows and fundraisers that support Native efforts. Make friends. And most importantly, take action and include action in your land acknowledgement. Learn about the concerns important to the local indigenous communities and support their work on environmental issues, voting, violence against women, and others. Lip service is shallow, and it is not enough. Number 6, tell the truth. Do not minimize atrocities. And finally, number 7, build consensus and understanding. We all benefit by honoring Wisconsin's Indigenous people and going forward together.
Thank you, Deb. And now we'll have Dee and Renee talk about who should be the people doing the land acknowledgements.
There are a couple of points, Jeanne, that I'd like to sort of draw out of Deb's presentation. She gave a wonderful presentation, but I would just like to make a finer point of it. And that is one of her recommendations that absolutely be honest, and that the process is going to require thoughtfulness and compassion. It's not going to be, it may not be something that you'll be able to delegate, because this is very difficult emotional labor to go through this. Again, there are countless issues associated with the land and the disbursement, the illegal disbursement of land to the settlers that can trigger emotional trauma. And so if you have the wherewithal to research, to consult, to ask someone, what is the protocol for gaining information or advice or wisdom from an elder? Because there is. There is a procedure. There's not a one-stop shopping center for Native American studies. So I just wanted to just kind of call that to your attention. And then finally, what I would recommend is it's a signal of sincerity. If the references that you make in your land acknowledgement are not only about the past and not only about the present, but the future generations of Native people who will continue to coexist with you on this land. Thank you.
Thank you for those additions, Dee. Renee?
Thank you. I always love learning from Dee. That's one beautiful. And who should do a land acknowledgement? I'm of the mindset that it shouldn't always be the Indigenous person who's called upon to do this. It's like that when I worked at the university is, they hire 0.5% minority faculty, and the 0.5% minority faculty have to be on every committee on the university so that they have some ethnic diversity on every committee. And so I'm of the mindset that it's the colonizers who really need to learn this history. It's the colonizers who have to negotiate, navigate what's in their heart, what's in their minds, and what is the purpose, and come up in some sense with a relationship with the Indigenous people. And so I don't feel that it should always be the Indigenous person's job to keep educating the dominant culture on their history. And so in my work, I always ask a non-Indigenous person first if they have the time and the energy to devote to create a land acknowledgement for whatever program's coming up. Because I think working through that process, you can't help but educate yourself, and you can't help but come up with new ideas and develop a more personal relationship with the Indigenous people and the land that you are living on. Dee?
I concur with that, of course, Renee. I really do think that when people go through that process, it's not about, if you tell me what I need to do, then we'll all be happy and we can go about the real business, right? We can do what the cool kids are doing rather than this obligation. So I'd like to just, reassure you that in the end, there's going to be some interesting information, history that wasn't taught in the schools, friendships and relationships that you'll discover, people that want to see us all live together in a mindful way, in a compassionate way. But I think that we're right on when we say this is not going to be easy. We recommended as a team that the language should not be polite. You can be courteous and be of a good mind, but it's not a place to soften the language, to say the words that need to be said, to talk about genocide, to talk about colonialism and how it first exists in the mind of those people being colonized. So I just think that, we're on to a good start, and it's okay if your organization decides to just put it on pause for a while, because this should be a thoughtful pursuit, asking yourself, why are we doing this? What do we expect from it? And are we in a good place to do this at this time in our country? Thank you.
Beautifully
Well,
said.
question, is there any thought about Indigenous people doing the land acknowledgement?
I would love at large gatherings like the the League of Women Voters state meeting, it would be beautiful if they would put effort into looking for a Menominee or Ojibwa person to do that land acknowledgement because of where the meeting will take place. And as Dee said, that's hard to do. And you have to reach out, and Indigenous people, we got a lot to do, just like you, to take time out of our schedules. It's always an honor to be asked, but it's also you're asking a lot of work from other people. So I do think it's a beautiful honor when I'm called upon to do these land acknowledgements at large gatherings or like at water protectors gatherings. That's always an honor, and it's a little nerve-wracking too, because of the audience that's there. But if you do ask an Indigenous person, make sure you know why you're asking. And it's got to be worth their time and their effort.
In the more traditional ceremonies, which are still going on, they're oftentimes referred to as the edge of the forest or the edge of the village ceremonies. There is a protocol that you would follow too. And so if you, venture into the tribal community and there's an elder or, a faith keeper that has agreed to help you, you'll need to give them a gift. Oftentimes we extend tobacco to that person, but it's not about some lovely gift you order from Amazon, but it's just a gesture of goodwill and diplomacy. I really I have a slightly different take on who should do the acknowledgement. I just think sometimes Native people, sometimes an elder, sometimes a veteran, sometimes an organizational president, sometimes a student, sometimes a community member who holds no title, who has a vested interest in just being in good relation to the rest of the people on this earth. So I think we should share this privilege, this responsibility, this obligation that we have to the land. And in doing so, we share something sacred, something holy between us.
Thank you both. All right. So this is the point where we as an organization need to take a deep look within. The League of Women Voters was founded predominantly by white women of means, predominantly for white women. It's important to accept our history of not being inclusive and of being focused on and centered on the dominant culture. This has led to a level of distrust that all leagues need to work on. And trust will not happen quickly. And leagues and league members need to learn to be patient and not expect trust to easily be earned by any marginalized communities. We can earn trust by showing up at events, supporting initiatives, and learning about the needs of local Indigenous communities or other communities. As my friend Renee told me early on in our friendship, and I'm paraphrasing here, you white women are too impatient. You need to learn to be patient and show up and show up and show up. Don't expect trust right away. Don't expect Native peoples to do your work for you. Don't expect to be accepted or even liked. Still, show up and show up and show up. And now, let's summarize some key points regarding the land acknowledgements. I'll put this down here. Okay. Acknowledge the indigenous nations who once inhabited or lived on the land, as well as those who currently inhabit the land. For example, the region currently occupied, the Anishinaabe, are in fact the homelands of the Dakota, and there's adequate evidence of other nations such as the Huron. Briefly refer to tribal history and how the land shapes personal identity. For example, the Menominee Nation are the people of the wild rice. And being from Appleton, I am on the ancestral lands of the Menominee Nation. Call for understanding of the effects of colonialism, broken treaties, and theft of land, and call it what it is. Don't sugarcoat it. Propose advocacy or action on specific issues. The program that you are having should guide the wording. And this is something that Dee brought up at one of our meetings. Explore the subject of the land back movement and consider a donation. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the land back movement or not, Dee.
I can just say a few words. In historical times, when there was the removal and relocation, people oftentimes lost their family land, the land allotments that they kept for themselves to occupy. And sometimes it was because of people who would come through as grifters, just out and out stealing land and selling it to the settlers. Sometimes it was because there were back taxes and the land was seized by the government. The land back movement has, in contemporary times, started that slow process of giving people 100 years, for example, to lease back the land, to give the land back that was stolen. That's perhaps, a long time to wait, but, waiting is worth it. Land back projects such as the Land Recovery Project at my reservation in White Earth is basically buying the land back, acre by acre, inch by inch. Even though we own it, not own it, but we occupied it, we're going to buy it back. So, if you have that space and time in your mind, if you were to say donate to Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Legal Fund, that would be a gesture, I think, that would help us build that trust and that relationship back again. So.
Thank you, Dee.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and in summary, Renee?
So in this slide, it's more than words, but we all know that words matter. Words are sometimes meant to wound, and words are sometimes meant to soothe. So we know words matter, but it's not the words that matter so much for the Indigenous, it's your action. Because we get a lot of words, read every treaty. You see there's a lot of words on every treaty, but there's little action, little good faith action that were behind all those words. So most Indigenous languages, there are more verbs than there are nouns, sometimes twice as many verbs than there are nouns. But in the English language, the noun is the dominant word. And so in much of US dominant culture, it's the thing that matters. Your material things matter more than the actions. But for Indigenous people, your actions matter a lot more than your words.
Thank you, Renee. And now I think we'll open it up to questions. We've got a lot in the chat. Do you mind if I just read them out of the chat? All right. I
Warren has hand raised.
Warren?
Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Okay.
All right. Hi, first of all, thank you so much. This could not have come at a better time for me. And next question is how much time we got? Because I've got I've got a few questions. I'm on the board of the Oshkosh Food Co-op, which is newly opened just last summer. And I'm the board's liaison to our food justice team. And one of the things that we're doing is creating a food justice page for the website of the food co-op. So what I'm asking about is something that hasn't literally been touched on yet this evening, which is a written land acknowledgement. So my first question is, are there any ways in which I need to think of a written land acknowledgement different from an orally delivered one?
Warren, I don't think so. Because
Okay.
again, it's the intent and the sincerity behind the words. It was what is the intent and purpose of the land acknowledgement. And many organizations have a written land acknowledgement posted on their website.
Okay. If I may, I just want to, if you think it'd be helpful, I'd like to put into the chat what we have got so far on our draft for our food justice page. We have two different places where we have land acknowledgements. And would it be okay if I put our draft into the chat so you folks can look at it and tell me what you think?
I'm wondering
Warren,
if that-
how long is the document?
It's 2 sentences.
Oh,
I'm just going to copy and paste that. In fact, I'm ready to drop it in now. I'm just going to paste in the small sections of our food justice page that include land acknowledgement. So here it is. So there's at the beginning of a belonging statement, and it states in part, the Oshkosh Food Co-op was placed with purpose in a food scarce area on land where indigenous peoples have gathered and grown food for thousands of years. And then separate from that, in another section of the page called Our Moments in Food Justice History, we have a sentence that states, our Oshkosh Food Co-op stands on the land of many indigenous peoples, including Ho-Chunk and Menominee, who stewarded it and grew their food here for centuries. So I'm very aware that, for one thing, there's no call for action here, and that needs to be part of our statement as well. But this is what we've got so
Yeah,
far.
Warren, I think those are really nice vague statements.
Yeah.
And I know that your organization's aware that the indigenous foods have really been removed from everything. I mean, so there's a huge movement to put indigenous foods back into indigenous cultures. And so if you look at the actions and perhaps pick one or two out there and support these organizations that are making an effort to use ancestral foods.
Okay.
You know, look for those organizations, name them, give them credit, give them, you know, the hand up that they need to help them do their job.
That sounds great.
that's a really good idea, Renee. And it is true that there is a movement out there, and part of it has to do with food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is, you know, can be a general term, but for us, it's talking about being, you know, in charge of our diet, because we know that our diet was, you know, pre-contact, the best for us, and that we would cultivate the land in a way, for example, through prescribed burns or cultural burns, so that the berries would, you know, grow like grapes in the wooded territories. So that food sovereignty is being responsible nutritionally, socially, labor-wise, and so on, making it local so that you cut the costs and distribution. Those kinds of exercises, I'm sure, the genius that you are, you will find a way to support that food sovereignty movement.
Well, I will certainly take that on. Thank you so much for the help. I really appreciate it.
There was a question from Louise Robbins. Might an Indigenous person offer a response rather than the actual acknowledgement? Any thoughts on that?
Louise, could you tell us more? Just what you had in mind. I just need to have a little bit more information.
Well, I actually people were talking about having an Indigenous person do the acknowledgement, and that does not seem a fit to me. But I thought maybe a prayer or an acknowledgement that we move forward together or something like that. Not, oh, I accept your apology sort of thing, but just, I see that you want to move forward together.
Okay.
Something like that would satisfy the need that some people have to having an Indigenous person participate in the acknowledgement.
Yeah, I can see where that would kind of size things up a little bit, and that there would be a coming together of people, tribal people, non-tribal, and so on. I just want to share with you in 2018, there was a farmer in Nebraska who lived and was aware of the Ponca tribe of folks that living in Nebraska. And what he decided that he was going to do is that he was going to give a parcel of land back to the tribe. And that would not have happened had they not come together over coffee, shared feasts together, formed a community out of the Keystone XL project, the pipeline project in that went through his territory as well. So you're right, it's almost as though this effort requires a certain sisterhood and brotherhood in a common cause, that the action be meaningful to both parties. And so I can appreciate what you're trying to get at, or what you've gotten at. And yeah, good, Louise.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments from anybody attending tonight? Okay, Kent Hutchison has his hand raised.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the presentation. Hi, Dee. You are fantastic.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. I'm doing great. Thank you for educating me. So I'm wondering, the land acknowledgement is great, and they seem to be more in fashion now than ever. And I'm concerned that the land acknowledgement for some people is like, a cap that they wear present, like currently, but then how can they make that land acknowledgement an entity or a company or an institution? How can they make that land acknowledgement more actionable in their day-to-day service or the things that they provide? Like, how can they make that more real in their existence as an entity? Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm just trying to put my thoughts together. And as everyone knows, silence is the voice of complicity. And that is when you're sitting back and others are working on land acknowledgement, others are working on food sovereignty, others are working on environmental justice, and you're sitting back and not taking part as an agent for social change. You have to figure out a way that you can make this world better for the children, for the seventh generation, as we call it. And there's always a way. My friend Kent is very involved in art and art for social change. And so that is that to me, that's a unique example of what you can do. Not all of us will be working, on tribal farms. We're not going to be environmental activists, but here's an artist who's figured out a way to, public art for social change. So where
Yeah.
there's a will, there's a way.
And you're providing a lot of support there also, Dee. So thank you. And I'm part of more than one group that is trying to figure out their land acknowledgement statement. And I hope that they say it and they absorb it, and they also adopt that land acknowledgement into how they hire people and into how they provide support for their staff and into what their building looks like. And I don't know if a lot of places are willing to do that at this point, but that's at least my vision.
Yeah, Kent, I think that's really an interesting question, is holding people accountable for what they say. For example, lots of cities are making May 5th proclamations and May 5th resolutions acknowledging MMIW and some of the causes. And so this year, many organizations are looking at previous statements, and we're going back to those mayors and say, what have you done for me lately? This is what you said you were going to do. Show me that you did it.
Right.
So perhaps in your organization, when you have that land acknowledgement, your statement up there says that this will be reviewed every 2 years, every year, to assess where it stands. What actions have we taken to support this? Do we really mean it? And
Thank
have
you.
that built into the organizational document.
Perfect. Thank you, Renee.
Could you tell people what MMIW is?
Oh, I'm sorry, missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Thank
It's an epidemic.
I'd like to just share a quote from an elder, a Cree elder from Canada. And she says, I think we need to start imagining a constellation of relationships that goes beyond land acknowledgements. It's great. That's awesome that you know about the treaties. That's great. It's awesome that you acknowledge that the land was not surrendered. Perhaps you have a presence as a legitimate citizen of this country, and we have not. But don't know how to deal with that we have not always enjoyed citizenship, but maybe now is the time to start learning about your obligations as a guest. What responsibilities do your host extend towards you, and you as a guest? What responsibilities are to be exercised on their behalf? And to what extent are these events benefiting both parties? That's Chelsea Vowell, a Métis Cree from Canada.
Thank you, Dee.